My wife had a brief fling with her boss, thinking all the while that I was totally in the dark about it. But she couldn't have been more wrong. While she was out meeting him in secret, I was quietly piecing together my own plan for payback. I'm not someone who jumps into revenge easily, but when it comes to protecting my family, I won't let anything or anyone stand in my way. Last July, I stumbled on the painful truth of her betrayal, and since then, I've been carrying around a hurt that's almost impossible to put into words. At first, I was completely clueless. I would have never imagined my wife could deceive me like this, not after 8 years of marriage. The thought alone seemed absurd. But as I look back, I remember something from a psychology conference I attended in college, where a well-known psychiatrist, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, explained the emotional stages people often go through when dealing with a deep loss: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally, acceptance. And, sure enough, denial was where I got stuck, clinging to the hope that Lily hadn't really been unfaithful. Admitting otherwise would mean the end of everything we'd built together. But the nagging reality that her betrayal was real weighed on me heavily, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I feared that by the time I got to acceptance, the hurt might have already left a permanent scar. I first met Lily in college while studying computer science. Oddly enough, it was an English class I was required to take for general education that brought us together. My interest in Shakespeare or poetry was minimal, my mind was usually occupied with coding and hanging out with friends. Picture your typical computer science nerd. I was tall and a bit awkward, doing just fine academically but far from extraordinary in sports or anything adventurous. The one thing I had going for me was my knack for helping classmates with their computers, though they often didn't remember my name after. My romantic experience was pretty limited too, just a short-lived thing with Rebecca, a high school friend who eventually moved away. My friends and I, also in the computer science program, would swap exaggerated stories of romantic feats, mostly just daydreams about girls we admired from afar. Then Lily came into my life, changing everything. The first day I sat next to her in that English class, I was struck by her hazel eyes. There was something about them that just held me, I couldn't look away. I was pretty much mesmerized the entire class. When she finally stood up to leave, I noticed her other features too. She had this soft, shoulder-length blonde hair, a delicate nose, and lips that naturally curled into a gentle smile. She was shorter than me, probably around 5 feet 5 inches, though I'm not exactly great at guessing height. Her shirt fit just right, showing off her curves, and her jeans complemented her figure in a way that made her look, to me, absolutely perfect. After that day, I made a point to sit beside her whenever I could. About a month in, she broke the ice, glancing at my calculus book and asking if I'd help her with college algebra, a class she was struggling with but needed to pass to graduate. For Lily, I'd have done just about anything. We started meeting at the library every Tuesday and Thursday after class for study sessions. I did my best to stay focused, but sitting beside the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen wasn't exactly easy. But in the end, it was worth it. Lily scored a high grade on her midterm, she got a solid B, and her excitement was contagious. When she found out, she jumped up and threw her arms around me, kissing me on the cheek. That simple kiss felt like I'd just taken off into the clouds. Almost before I realized it, I blurted out, "Want to catch a movie this Friday?" "Sure," she replied smoothly, "what time?" I could hardly believe it, did she really just say yes? I practically floated all the way back to my dorm. The rest of that week felt like a whirlwind. I even went out of my comfort zone to pick up a new pair of Dockers and a polo shirt, something a bit sharper than my usual look. My friends, all equally nerdy, gave me no end of grief over it, but I took their teasing in stride, counting down every minute until our date. Finally, Friday night arrived. Our first date was to see the latest Halloween movie. Nothing highbrow, just a typical horror flick packed with gory scenes, dismembered limbs, and the usual lineup of predictable characters. I figured she'd be grabbing onto me in fright, but she sat there cool as can be, unfazed by it all. Despite the not-so-romantic movie choice, we had a fantastic time together. There was an undeniable spark between us, so much so that after that night, she was the one to ask me out again. From that moment, it was official, we were a couple. As it turned out, Lily and I shared more than just a spark, we had a ton in common. We loved the same movies, read similar books, and had a mutual appreciation for certain foods. After a few months, I realized I was completely smitten. As finals approached, I became more convinced she felt the same. One night, just before Christmas break, I found myself lying beside her, working up the nerve to confess. I told her she was the best thing that had ever happened to me. She smiled warmly and said, "I love you too." In that moment, everything felt right in the world. Although we didn't share any classes in the spring, we kept up our routine, meeting at the library every day to study, picking up right where we'd left off after the holidays. With every week that passed, our bond grew even stronger. We spent spring break together in a cozy cabin by the lake. I'd planned for us to go hiking and fishing, but we ended up spending the whole week cozied up inside. On the final night, I got down on one knee and proposed, and to my joy, she said yes. 3 months later, we graduated, and 5 months after that, we were married. After college, I landed a job in cybersecurity, working for a company that specialized in installing security software for small businesses, usually with about 10 to 50 workstations. My main task was writing code to make various systems communicate smoothly with one another. My supervisor, Dan, had started the company 10 years earlier with just 2 employees. Thanks to mergers and acquisitions, it had grown to around 50 employees and was doing really well. Dan was more than just a good boss, he was a mentor I respected and learned a lot from. 5 years into my time there, Dan got an offer from a venture capital firm. They had their eye on our stronghold in the small business market to balance their larger computer division, and the financial incentives were just too good to pass up. Dan decided to sell the company but reassured us he'd stay on as manager and that no one would be losing their job. The transition turned out to be surprisingly smooth, with barely any change to our day-to-day work. The new owners were almost invisible, while Dan continued running things as usual. Around the same time, Lily found a job managing the office for Dr. Blake, a local dentist. He was an older guy with the scattered personality of an absent-minded professor. Always misplacing his glasses and walking around with a dazed look, he was like someone straight out of a comedy. But for all his quirks, Dr. Blake was a skilled dentist, and patients would travel from far and wide to see him, assuming they could actually secure an appointment with his busy schedule. When Lily started at Dr. Blake's office, the place was a disaster. Bills weren't getting paid on time, files went missing constantly, and the billing system was an outdated mess from who knows when. It was total chaos. But Lily took charge and whipped everything into shape. After 3 years under her leadership, Dr. Blake's practice was almost unrecognizable. Revenue had shot up, employee turnover dropped dramatically, and the whole place felt brighter and more upbeat. Even Dr. Blake himself seemed like a new man. Lily deserved every bit of credit for the transformation, and I couldn't have been prouder to call her my wife. After we got married, we moved into a modest little apartment near my job. It wasn't anything fancy, but we turned it into our cozy retreat, filling each corner with memories. We both agreed that we'd concentrate on building our careers before thinking about starting a family. Every year, we'd take a trip to celebrate our anniversary. In the beginning, money was tight, so we'd usually head to the cabin by the lake. But as time went on, we managed to splurge a bit, with the highlight being a magical trip to Disney World in Florida. 5 years slipped by in that apartment, and we finally decided it was time to look for a house. After a couple of months of searching, we found a charming place that felt just right for our future family. Once again, we poured love into every room and built a life together there. About 7 years later, Lily came home one evening practically glowing with excitement. She'd managed to catch the attention of some big-name executives who were patients of Dr. Blake. They'd taken notice of how much the office had improved since Lily started running things. They spoke to Dr. Blake, who sang her praises, and before long, one of those execs offered her a new job. We discussed it that night and for days afterward, weighing how the position could impact our plans to start a family. I had this uneasy feeling that this career move might push those plans further down the road. Financially, there wasn't any urgent reason for Lily to take the job, especially since she was close with Dr. Blake. But Lily saw it differently. She pointed out the professional growth this role could offer her and suggested we hold off on starting a family for a bit longer, assuring me she could handle any setbacks. In the end, I didn't feel like I had much choice but to support her decision. A month later, Lily stepped into her new role as personal assistant to Tina Nick Khan, the Vice President of Finance at Cascade Capital. Little did I know that Cascade Capital happened to be the very venture capital firm that owned the company where I worked. At first, I didn't notice any shifts in our relationship. While our intimate life did take a hit, I chalked it up to the crazy hours she was keeping with her boss. She'd sometimes have to stay late for meetings and would come home looking utterly drained. But as time went on, the distance between us only grew. Despite my efforts to reconnect, Lily brushed off my advances again and again. Thinking back, I can't remember us being intimate at all in the 2 months leading up to her company's annual awards dinner. It didn't even cross my mind that she might be unfaithful. The idea was so out of left field that it just never registered with me. But on the night of her company's annual awards dinner, I discovered the truth, that Lily was having an affair with her boss. I was in utter disbelief. Every year, her company hosted this dinner to celebrate the year's achievements and recognize top performers. That was the night everything changed. We'd both received invitations to the awards dinner, and as we got ready to leave, I was still wrestling with the idea that Lily might actually be betraying me. I mentally replayed the past few months, searching for any warning signs, but nothing came to mind. Our love felt so real, I'd trusted her completely, never once doubting her loyalty. Looking back, maybe I was simply blinded by how deeply I loved her. I needed concrete proof, something undeniable that I could witness myself. Pushing aside my suspicions, I focused on getting dressed for the evening. As I watched Lily prepare, I studied every detail, her outfit, her makeup, even her choice of lingerie. On the drive to the venue, I stayed silent, while she chattered excitedly about her boss, Mr. Nick Khan, who was expected to receive some award, likely for profits or something in that vein. If the rumors were true, I knew my anger would boil over soon, but I held it back, determined to keep my composure until I knew for sure. I felt strangely like Peter Banner, containing the storm brewing inside. We arrived right on time, thanks to Lily's precise planning. Once there, she threw herself into making sure everything was running smoothly, leaving me free to observe from the sidelines. About 15 minutes later, Mr. Nick Khan entered with his stunning wife on his arm. I couldn't help but wonder, why would he need Lily's constant attention when he had such a beautiful woman at home? I made my way to the bar, ordered a drink, and watched him closely. People flocked to him, fawning and treating him like he was some kind of celebrity, their eagerness to impress him almost nauseating. Meanwhile, Julia, his wife, mingled with the other executives' wives, while I kept an eye on Nick and Lily from a distance. The glances they exchanged, the subtle touches, the warm smiles, all of it hinted at something far more than a simple boss-assistant relationship. As the evening wore on, Nick and his wife took their seats at the main table while Lily strategically positioned herself across from him. The event itself dragged on, one award after another, dull speeches, and lackluster food. Once dinner wrapped up, the tables were cleared for dancing. I tried to keep Lily close by my side, but she was often pulled away to help Nick with various tasks. Every time they were together, I did my best to keep an eye on them, but with her colleagues stopping by to chat, it was impossible to stay vigilant the entire time. Lily and I danced a few times, sometimes close, sometimes with a bit of distance between us. As midnight approached, fatigue hit me, and I suggested we call it a night. She agreed, though a hint of reluctance showed on her face. Just before we left, she asked for one last dance. That final dance was where it all unraveled. During our earlier dances, I'd noticed she was wearing underwear, but now, as I held her close, her backside felt bare. The blue thong she'd put on earlier was gone. My heart shattered right then and there. Throughout our relationship, she'd never gone without underwear, even when I jokingly asked her to, she'd always declined. But now, for him, she'd done it. We said our goodbyes and left the venue in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. For me, the drive home was a descent into my own personal hell. Once we got home, Lily rushed upstairs, saying something about needing a shower before bed. I barely responded and just slipped under the covers, feeling drained. A few minutes later, she joined me, dressed in a simple cotton nightgown. She leaned over, whispered, "Wasn't it a wonderful night?" I pretended to be asleep as she kissed my cheek and turned over. Soon, her steady breathing told me she'd drifted off, and that's when the tears finally came, soaking into my pillow. The next morning, standing under the scalding spray of the shower, I felt like I was being hit with every human emotion at once: love, hate, fury, anguish, all mixing together with moments of revenge and flickers of forgiveness. I felt inadequate for not protecting my marriage, foolish for not seeing the signs, and, strangely, even a little triumphant for finally uncovering the truth. My mind was a storm of emotions, thoughts clashing and twisting inside me. By the time I turned off the water, anger had taken hold. He would pay for what he'd done. In the days that followed, I focused on finding ways to make him suffer for the damage he'd caused my marriage. Sure, murder was out of the question, but the thought of ambushing him with a lead pipe to the knees crossed my mind more than once. Still, I knew there had to be a smarter way to deal with this. And as much as I blamed him, I couldn't ignore Lily's role in all this. She betrayed me, breaking the promises we'd made to each other. I found myself reflecting on our years together, questioning where I might have gone wrong and when exactly things had shifted between us. Had his wealth and influence swayed her? I'd trusted her, poured years of my life into our relationship, years I could never get back. But now, they'd both pay for that betrayal. A few days later, a potential solution seemed to fall right into my lap. Lily announced she was heading to the mall for some shoe shopping, but she'd left her laptop open on the counter, practically inviting me to take a look. I wondered if I could use this chance to gain access to her company's system and set my plan in motion. With my background in cybersecurity, breaking in seemed almost too easy. I powered up her laptop, connected to her work network, and waited for the password prompt. Knowing Lily, I figured it wouldn't be too hard to crack. Just before I started guessing, I noticed her planner nearby. Surely, being married to someone in cybersecurity, she would know better than to write down her passwords, right? But as I flipped through the pages, I quickly found a section labeled PW with her password right there. And as I kept looking, I found a goldmine, not only her own login details but also those of Mr. Nick Khan, along with credit card numbers, bank account info, birth dates, and social security numbers. I grabbed my keys and drove to Kinko's to photocopy every page of that planner, deciding to dig deeper into her system later. A few days later, luck struck again. Lily left her computer unattended on the counter while she stepped out, and I seized the opportunity. I powered it up, used her password, and got full access to her account. Given her role as the VP's assistant, she had almost unrestricted access to payroll, purchasing, accounting, and even some of the production systems. As I scrolled through her emails, I fought the urge to dig into her personal messages. I didn't want to intrude on that, especially with all my own feelings still churning. My focus was on finding something within the company files that I could use against him. My attention turned to the accounting system, which, to my surprise, was basic and lacked serious security. This might just be the opening I needed. A quick glance at the purchasing system revealed a setup where invoices required approval before any payment was processed, a potential vulnerability I could exploit. An idea started to take shape: I'd alter approved invoices to redirect funds into Nickens' accounts, then sit back and watch as everything unraveled when the auditors eventually caught on to the discrepancies. It was a near-perfect plan. Nickens' reputation would be left in tatters, Lily would lose her job, and their affair would be brought to a screeching halt. The very next day, I began putting my plan into action, using all the information I'd gathered from Lily's planner. I opened 2 bank accounts in Nickens' name at separate banks in the city. Once I had those set up, the final step was to access Lily's work computer to initiate the transfers. The next day, while she was at the gym, I seized the opportunity. Using Nickens' password, I logged in and went straight to the accounting system. I discovered an invoice section specifically for manufacturer rebates and added a 3% rebate, plugging in Nickens' bank details for the routing. I kept the percentage small to avoid immediate suspicion, then repeated the same process with another invoice, this time routing the funds to the second account. After logging out, I poured myself a glass of whiskey, this time, a good one. The first sip was a toast to my carefully crafted plan, the second, a small comfort as I faced the harsh reality of my broken marriage. I waited a few days, expecting something to happen, police knocking at the door, scandalous headlines, anything, but there was nothing. No fallout at all. Maybe the plan was solid but needed a little more punch. Determined to raise the stakes, I prepared to try again. But just then, I received a call from Dan, my supervisor, who informed me that I was being sent to New York for a business trip next week. I was caught off guard. It was unusual for the company to require travel on such short notice, especially for my position. A sinking feeling hit me. Nick Khan was likely behind this, trying to get me out of the way so he and Lily could enjoy their time together uninterrupted. Reluctantly, I agreed. "All right, Dan. I'll go. Thanks." As he handed me the plane tickets, I knew this was only the beginning. So long as Nick Khan remained free, my misery would continue. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, there was a noticeable tension in the air. Frustration gnawed at me, while Lily seemed to avoid any hint of intimacy. I tried to initiate a few romantic moments, but she rejected each attempt, leaving me feeling even more isolated. Trying to keep up appearances, I casually mentioned my upcoming trip to New York. Lily feigned sadness about my absence, but then, without thinking, she let slip her excitement about going to the theater next week. Realizing her mistake, she quickly covered by saying she meant she was going to the movies with friends to catch a chick flick. I let the lie slide, but my mind couldn't help drifting to Nickens' wife, Julia. If Lily was making excuses, then Julia might be doing the same. I reached for my whiskey, using it as a numbing agent, though I was aware this was quickly becoming an unhealthy habit. With Lily's upcoming plans bringing her even closer to my target, I decided it was time to take things a step further. The next day, I opened bank accounts in her name at 2 banks downtown. By the weekend, I had diverted funds into both her and Nickens' accounts. Their downfall felt close, almost tangible. Inside, I could feel a dark change brewing, a shift from the easygoing person I used to be. I sensed a more sinister side of myself emerging, one I hadn't known was there, and I wasn't sure if I liked what I was becoming. Frustration gnawed at me as I wondered why the accounting team hadn't yet caught onto the thefts. The New York trip itself was both fascinating and exhausting, with the flight being particularly miserable. Since 9/11, air travel had turned into a tiresome ordeal filled with endless security checks, long lines, and the kind of exhaustion that sets in before you even arrive. When I finally got to the hotel, I headed straight to my room to rest. The next day, I worked through the office tasks, wrapping up by 2 p.m. But the rest of the trip was a blur of troubleshooting, dealing with faulty cables, problematic graphics cards, and a dead hard drive. By the end, it all felt like a waste of time, and my anger over Lily and Nickens' affair simmered just beneath the surface. On Tuesday night, alone in my hotel room, I found myself staring at the walls, feeling consumed by the weight of her betrayal. I did manage to escape briefly to the Empire State Building, but even the view was clouded by the heaviness in my chest. By Friday, I was back home, greeting Lily with a quick peck on the cheek before heading to bed, avoiding the painful pretense of intimacy that had become our routine. The trip to New York made me reconsider my goals. How did I want this all to play out? And where did Nickens' wife, Julia, fit into this tangled mess? In the weeks that followed, I took every chance I could to access the company's system, hoping the auditors would eventually spot the discrepancies. The amount of money at play was far from insignificant. Then came more news. I was being sent to Denver. Dan informed me that the New York office was pleased with my work and had requested similar updates in Denver. He seemed as puzzled by the request as I was. Arriving in Denver, I felt a mix of apprehension and resolve. This was another opportunity to escalate my plans, but I knew I needed to stay focused. The first few days followed a familiar pattern, some system security training, then hours holed up in my hotel room. During this time, I accessed the fraudulent accounts I'd set up for NickCon. Together, they now held over $1 million. The thought of divorce loomed larger, and I found myself wondering if this money could be considered shared property. I let out a bitter laugh at the thought. As the days wore on, the idea of that money started to consume me. I considered suing NickCon, which could lead to a substantial payout, or perhaps just taking the funds and calling it justified revenge. But was I willing to match betrayal with betrayal? They'd already ruined my life, leaving me feeling humiliated and directionless. Was I even thinking rationally anymore? In the end, I decided, why not go for it? A week later, I was on a flight to Miami, armed with a plan. I finished the security updates by Tuesday, and on Wednesday morning, I flew to the Bahamas. Setting up a bank account in Nickens' name was surprisingly easy, so I took the opportunity to make a quick trip to Grand Cayman to open an account for Lily as well. I returned to Miami just in time for my flight home, collapsing into bed and sleeping until midday Saturday. 2 weeks later, I was on yet another plane, this time bound for Boston. The logistics were a challenge, but I managed to work in a detour to Zurich, where I opened a few more accounts. Once home, I began transferring funds into these offshore accounts, occasionally shifting the money between them at different intervals. This routine continued over the months that followed. About every 3 weeks, I found myself on yet another seemingly pointless mission, hopping from city to city, Seattle, Phoenix, Atlanta, each trip serving as another link in my chain of carefully laid plans. During a trip to Phoenix, I took advantage of my proximity to extend the stay and head to Mexico City, setting up yet another offshore account. Back at home, I regularly accessed Nickens' accounting system, tweaking invoices and routing funds through local banks before sending them offshore. Strangely enough, the meticulous planning and execution of these maneuvers became a twisted comfort in the midst of my chaotic life. Meanwhile, my relationship with Lily had deteriorated into something that barely resembled a marriage. We interacted only briefly, our lives intersecting in short, shallow moments. She kept her world carefully out of my reach, concealed from any scrutiny. Every attempt I made to bridge the growing gap between us only led to arguments over the most trivial things, how the dishes were arranged in the dishwasher, or where a coffee cup belonged. It was hard to shake the feeling that these little conflicts were deliberate, distractions meant to keep us separated. In November, I managed to pull off a bold move that left me feeling strangely proud. I'd gained access to Lily's schedule and noticed a lunch date she had planned with NickCon. As lunchtime approached, I bought a dozen roses, hoping to catch her off guard and remind her that I still cared. When I arrived at her office, her co-workers admired the flowers, complimenting me as the thoughtful husband. Just as they were about to leave for lunch, I found out that Lily was still stuck in a meeting. I asked if I could leave the flowers on her desk, and they happily agreed. Once inside her office, I closed the door behind me and slipped into her chair, logging into her computer. With a few well-placed keystrokes, I adjusted some invoices and accessed her bank account, fully aware that I was leaving a trail that would be incriminating if the auditors ever picked up on it. After that, I headed to Nickens' office. While on his computer, I stumbled across a folder filled with explicit images of Lily in various poses, saved for his private viewing. The pain was sharp, but it didn't cut as deeply as the first time I discovered the affair. I copied the entire folder onto a USB drive I always carried, a grim token of their betrayal, and slipped out of the office unnoticed. That evening, Lily was thrilled with the roses, showering me with affection. She even granted me a rare moment of intimacy, a brief echo of the connection we once had. Yet, beneath it all, I couldn't escape the nagging reality that the next day would pull me back into the bitter truth of our lives, her lover always lurking just beyond reach. A month later, I casually mentioned to Lily that I planned to take a French course at the local community college, with classes on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Her excitement was hard to miss. She seemed almost relieved at the idea of having 2 more nights to herself, likely with Nick Khan. It was part of my own strategy to create distance, finding that the more time I spent away from Lily, the less the tension seemed to mount between us. Despite the tangled web of lies I spun around work, I actually attended the classes. The instructor was accommodating, and I even managed to earn a B in the course. Meanwhile, their affair showed no signs of slowing down, and the auditors continued to miss the signs of the financial storm brewing right under their noses. I found myself wondering how people like Lily and Nick Khan could keep up the charade. Thoughts of corporate giants like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac briefly crossed my mind, but I quickly dismissed them, feeling they had little relevance to the personal disaster my life had become. Still, an instinct told me that the situation was on the verge of imploding. With the fiscal year-end fast approaching, Lily's company was under pressure to finalize their financial records, which meant they'd soon be tracking down any missing funds. It was only a matter of time before the discrepancies would come to light. One afternoon, while I was lounging by the pool at a hotel in Los Angeles, I got a frantic call from Lily. She sounded panicked, mentioning an unexpected audit, her voice tight with urgency, and told me she'd be delayed, insisting I not contact her that night. I took a slow sip of my banana daiquiri, trying to maintain an air of calm as I replied, "Of course, dear. Good luck." Once the call ended, I sprang into action, carrying out my exit plan with precision. I transferred the remaining funds into an account in Mexico and booked a flight there. When I arrived, I withdrew everything, converting it into bonds that I secured carefully. Just as I was finishing up, Lily called again, pleading with me to come home soon. I feigned busyness, telling her I was still tied up with security work but would aim to return by Thursday. I ordered another drink, a satisfied smile creeping onto my face. It felt like the storm I'd been anticipating had finally arrived. The next day, the online news outlets were ablaze with headlines about their arrests. Bold titles like "Top Executive and Lover Arrested in Large-Scale Fraud" jumped off the screen. The accompanying photos showed them with shocked expressions, caught completely off guard as their world unraveled. The reports detailed how funds had been siphoned from multiple accounts for personal gain, with investigators even tracking some of the money to the Cayman Islands. They planned to work with local authorities to access these accounts. Bail was set at $1 million each. When I returned home that Thursday night, I barely slept, my mind buzzing with thoughts of what was unfolding. Early Friday morning, I arrived at the courthouse, and using our home as collateral, I managed to secure Lily's bail. By 2 p.m., she was released into my custody. The drive home was thick with silence, punctuated only by the sound of Lily's quiet sobs. Once inside, she headed upstairs, muttering something about needing a shower to wash off the lingering smell of jail. I poured myself a whiskey, struck by the memory of her similar, frantic rush to the shower after last year's awards dinner, an echo of the past that now felt distant and detached. A few minutes later, Lily came downstairs in a long bathrobe. Sitting across from me, she insisted on her innocence, claiming adamantly that she hadn't stolen a dime. The affair hung between us, unspoken but undeniable. I chose not to press her, suggesting that perhaps it was all a misunderstanding, and assured her I'd hire a lawyer to fight the charges. As we waited for the trial, our home took on a chill, the atmosphere heavy and distant. Lily spoke little, steering clear of any mention of Nick Khan. My routine fell into a dull cycle of work and home, with Lily rarely venturing out. I'd heard that Nick Khan intended to fight the charges as well, often meeting with her lawyer, though beyond that, Lily seemed trapped in her own isolated world. I suspected that Nick's wife, Julia, was preparing to file for divorce, adding yet another layer to the web of deceit that surrounded us. Lily seemed to attempt reconciliation, preparing dinner each evening when I came home, though she avoided mentioning Nick Khan or anything from the past year. I assumed she was trying to bury the hatchet, hoping to salvage some part of our relationship. Occasionally, she even made attempts to rekindle intimacy, which I accepted, but the connection felt hollow, like a quick patch over a wound too deep to truly heal. As the trial drew nearer, I kept myself informed through the newspaper reports, tracking each development with a mix of grim satisfaction and detachment. Federal authorities had managed to trace the missing funds from the Cayman Islands to Zurich, then onward to Mexico, but at that point, the trail went cold. I half expected the police to show up at my door any day, ready to haul me in, but so far, I remained untouched. In the days leading up to the trial, Lily put in a noticeable effort to win me over, as if trying to patch things up. But the damage between us felt beyond repair. I quietly met with a divorce lawyer and started preparing the paperwork. The trial itself was swift, lasting just 3 days. By then, the media's attention had drifted to other scandals, leaving this one mostly forgotten. Throughout the trial, Lily and Nick Khan sat at opposite ends of the defense table, separated by their lawyers, the distance between them as tangible as the tension in the room. I attended every day, listening as the auditors laid out a detailed account of the crimes and mapped out the money trail. The prosecution presented a strong case, tying the transactions to both Lily and Nick's computer logins. The defense tried to claim their passwords had been hacked, but the prosecution countered with evidence linking the transactions directly to their devices. It was clear both Lily and Nick Khan were in serious trouble. The prosecution painted Nick Khan as a controlling mastermind and portrayed Lily as a reluctant accomplice. I sensed that the jury found these arguments persuasive. After 3 exhausting days of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. Lily and I found ourselves alone in a small meeting room, the air thick with tension. I was ready to close this chapter of our lives, so I pulled out the divorce papers, citing irreconcilable differences. Lily's face fell, her eyes clouded with sorrow, likely expecting I'd accuse her of adultery. But before she could respond, I cut her off. "That was never proven," she said, her voice trembling. Her words triggered a memory, a story I'd once read about a man whose life had similarly unraveled. He had left work early to catch a World Series game between the Oakland Athletics and the San Francisco Giants when the Loma Prieta earthquake struck. Dodging falling bricks and debris, he'd narrowly escaped death. That brush with mortality forced him to confront a deep unhappiness and unfulfilled desires he'd ignored for years. Without a word to anyone, he packed his belongings and vanished from the lives of his wife and children. Years later, authorities found him. He'd built a new life for himself, complete with a happy marriage and a child. After his arrest, a psychiatrist determined that his near-death experience had fundamentally altered his view of life. Mortality suddenly felt ever-present, lurking around every corner, and escaping his old life seemed like his only option at the time. Over the years, however, he'd realized that he no longer lived under that shadow. Eventually, he tried returning to his former life, seeking to reclaim his role as a husband and father. In some way, I felt I could relate to that man's experience. There was a time when I loved deeply and trusted wholeheartedly, living by principles of honesty and integrity. I filed my taxes honestly, spoke only truths, and devoted all my energy to those I cared about. Lily was my world, and my love for her had been absolute. But losing someone through betrayal leaves a wound that cuts deeper than any physical pain, one that seeps into the soul and tightens around the heart. With the abrupt upheaval of my world, I found myself morphing into someone I barely recognized. I'm not proud of this version of myself. Now, I'm at a crossroads. Do I stay guarded, keeping my heart walled off from the darkness I've uncovered within myself? Or do I take a chance, slowly opening up to others, letting the better parts of me re-emerge? I still don't have the answer, but there's a little blonde girl at the bakery who often catches my eye, stirring something within me that feels almost hopeful. Let me take you back to when my ex-wife and I first crossed paths during our university days. We met by chance during our second lecture as freshmen, sitting next to each other. We were young, full of dreams, each of us hopeful about the future. I'd always longed for a partner who shared my vision of the life I wanted to build. It might sound odd, but the first thing that drew me to her was her handwriting. It was elegant, almost like art, and I was surprised to see someone my age write with such perfect penmanship. But it wasn't just her handwriting. She was a vision, her ocean blue eyes, golden hair cascading over her shoulders, and a smile that could brighten any dark day. Normally, I kept to myself, letting others make the first move, but with her, I made an exception. Our conversation blossomed that day in the lecture hall, and soon, we became inseparable, always finding our way back to each other in every class. I have something to show you, I said, pulling a small stack of photographs from my pocket. I handed her the first one, a picture of Julia and me at the top of the Empire State Building, a memory that now felt like a cruel twist of fate. I'm not accusing you of adultery, I confessed, my voice steady yet weighed down with emotion. I'm admitting my own guilt. I went on, telling her about how Nick's wife, Julia, had come to my office on the night of last year's awards dinner. She'd hired a private investigator to follow Nick Khan, uncovering proof of his affairs. At first, I didn't believe her, refusing to accept the claims until I saw them together that night. It was a confirmation of her worst fears, and my own. Later, I'd reached out to her, wanting to apologize for my doubts. The memories washed over me as I paused, then continued, when Nick Khan sent me to New York with you, I realized why he did it, so the two of you could be together. I wondered how you managed to get Julia out of the city. To my surprise, Julia had shown up at my hotel room one Tuesday night. We spent the evening with wine, sharing stories of betrayal, unearthing the depths of Nick's deception. Julia admitted that her investigator had recorded calls, including ones about my trip. She even offered to leave the city to visit her mother, a ruse to keep Nick Khan unaware. Most of our time in New York was spent in my hotel room, except for a visit to the Empire State Building, where Julia played tour guide. Despite what you may think, I added, Julia and I kept boundaries. We didn't cross that line. I handed her more photos, each one documenting moments of companionship. One showed us in Denver, sharing stories of heartbreak. Julia had even shared recordings of you with Nick Khan, where you were mostly urging her to cut off intimacy with me. That's when I finally understood why our own intimate life had fallen apart. Over a bottle of whiskey, Julia and I found a kind of solace in each other's company. We weren't in love, just two broken souls trying to find comfort amidst the ruins of our relationships. We tried to heal the wounds that Nick Khan and you had inflicted on us. I laid out more photos of Julia and me, snapshots taken in Seattle, Phoenix, and Boston. Each captured a fleeting moment of joy as we explored places that Lily and I had once dreamed of visiting together. By that point, Julia and I had become close friends, friends with benefits, you could say. I showed Lily the photos from Miami, where Julia looked stunning in a bikini, exuding a confident elegance. I glanced over at Lily, studying her reaction. And there's another woman in these, I added, mentioning a close friend of Julia's who had joined us. When I mentioned my long-held fantasy of being with two women at once, I told her it lived up to every expectation. But as I watched Lily's eyes fill with tears, a pang of regret hit me. If only she'd confessed her indiscretion sooner, we might have been able to work things out. If she'd come to me back then, expressing her desire to end our marriage for Nick Khan, it would have hurt, yes, but it wouldn't have shattered me as completely as everything had now. I regretted how it had all played out. As I got up to leave, I looked at her one last time. "Goodbye, Lily. I once loved you." With those words hanging heavily in the air, I walked out. By the time the verdict was announced, I'd packed up everything. Both Lily and Nick Khan were found guilty. Since the funds had never been recovered, Nick Khan received a 7-year sentence, while Lily was sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by 2 years of probation. My lawyer handled the sale of our house and its remaining contents. I instructed him to pack up all of Lily's belongings and store them in a unit. The proceeds from the house, along with half of our savings, were placed in an escrow account for her. By midnight, I was on a flight to France. Standing on the balcony of my modest house overlooking the Côte d'Azur, I could see the beach from my vantage point, even though it was a few blocks away. I walked there almost daily, enjoying a bottle of fine wine while reflecting on the whirlwind of the past year. Since relocating to the south of France, I hadn't returned to the US, not since the trial. I had no contact with Lily and found myself growing into a solitary figure in this humble home I now called my own. Though I referred to it as ma maison, it was simply a place that felt like mine. Julia visited a few times, but I knew our connection would never develop beyond friends with benefits, enjoyable as those benefits were. The second time she visited, her friend joined us, adding an even richer layer to the experience. Julia's divorce had gone smoothly, and I had no doubt she'd bring joy to some lucky bachelor, provided he could handle her lingering trust issues. She knew about my plans to confront Lily and Nick Khan and felt satisfied that they had both faced consequences. Content with her own life, she moved on. As for me, I faced my own challenges. I didn't need to work, thanks to my stock market gains, but I had started a small online business developing software for system integration, similar to the work I'd done for Dan. I could manage it all remotely and had secured a few contracts to keep me busy. Even Dan reached out with a friendly email, acknowledging my work and offering to refer me to some clients. I thanked him. The ladies at the local bakery found my French amusing, taking it upon themselves to teach me new words each day. At this rate, I figured I'd be fluent by the time I was 100. While I had made progress in dealing with Lily's betrayal and moving on after our divorce, I still struggled to come to terms with my own choices and the person I'd become. I thought back to a case I'd studied in a psychology class in college, about a husband who had vanished from his life, leaving behind a wife and 2 young children in the San Francisco Bay Area. He'd disappeared one day after leaving work and was only found years later, having started a new life entirely. When he was finally located, he'd created a fresh existence, complete with a new marriage and a child. It turned out that a near-death experience had jolted him into rethinking his life. He'd realized that his happiness was a facade, and facing mortality had driven him to escape. But over time, he came to see that the life he ran to was no better than the one he'd left behind. He eventually returned to his family, attempting to resume his role as a husband and father. Perhaps, in some strange way, I could understand that man's journey. The life I'd known, grounded in love, trust, and integrity, had been irrevocably shattered. My taxes had always been filed meticulously, my words honest, my mind focused on caring for those around me. Lily had been my world, my love for her unwavering. But the pain of betrayal cuts deeper than any physical wound, creeping into the soul and leaving scars that are hard to ignore. With the abrupt shift in my reality, I found myself transformed into someone I barely recognized, a man caught between bitterness and survival. I can't say I'm proud of this version of myself. It was a thrill to make a new friend that first year in college, especially since we were both freshmen navigating the unfamiliar world of university life without knowing a single soul. We decided to stick together, and before long, we were inseparable. My ex-wife and I went from friends to best friends, though it wasn't until our 3rd year that we started dating. Part of me held back, hesitant to ask her out because of how close we were. I was terrified of losing her if she didn't feel the same. But eventually, I realized that staying quiet about my feelings was a mistake, especially as I started noticing other guys showing interest in her. She'd even share those encounters with me, and it became harder and harder to keep my feelings bottled up. I finally decided it was worth the risk of rejection rather than hiding what I felt, so I took the leap and asked her out. To my immense relief, she said yes. Almost instinctively, I asked if she'd move in with me, and she agreed. That was the moment our love story truly began. I loved her more deeply than I'd ever loved anyone. Even as a student with a modest income from my part-time job, I did everything I could to make her happy. We went to parties, attended concerts, and created endless memories together. It became well known across campus that we were dating, and anyone who saw us together could tell we were a couple. The way I cared for her caught people's attention. They'd often ask how long we'd been together, enchanted by the bond we shared. Beyond being a couple that had fun and went on adventures, we supported each other through academics and life's challenges, making sure we both graduated successfully. Our families knew about our relationship and respected our choice to live together. After graduation, I was fortunate to land a well-paying job, but my ex-wife's journey was different. We'd applied to the same companies, but while I secured a position, she faced rejection after rejection, and each one wore on her spirit. I helped her refine her resume, practiced interview techniques with her, and encouraged her, but the job offers just weren't coming. At first, we believed it was only a temporary setback, and with that optimism, we decided to get married. Our wedding was a beautiful, intimate affair surrounded by friends and family who supported us wholeheartedly. After the wedding, we moved out of the tiny studio apartment where we'd been living and rented a spacious two-bedroom place. I took on all the financial responsibilities, covering rent, bills, and groceries. I understood that she was struggling to find work, and neither of us wanted her to settle for a job that might make her feel too comfortable staying where she was. We agreed to hold off on having kids until we were both stable financially. Even with my job's demands, working 2 weeks on site and 2 weeks remotely, I made it a point to prioritize our quality time. I wanted her to feel cherished, so I'd often stop to buy her flowers, pick up groceries, or surprise her with jewelry, a handbag, or chocolates. I did all of this to shield her from the emotional burden of not having a job, showing her that I was genuinely happy doing these things for her. I even went so far as to drain my savings every month, just to make sure she had everything she needed. A year went by, and despite her endless job applications, my ex-wife still hadn't found the kind of job she'd been hoping for. In the 11th month of her job search, she finally agreed to take on small, menial jobs that didn't pay much. After many conversations, she reluctantly accepted this path, though I continued to insist she didn't need to contribute a single penny toward the household bills. I wanted her to keep her earnings for herself, hoping it would bring her some happiness. Our days together were filled with simple joys, cooking meals side by side, taking long, relaxing baths, and going for evening walks that often ended with us hunting for ice cream at roadside stands. With each passing day, our bond seemed to grow stronger. Then, one day, my world crumbled. I was working from home while she was on a day shift at a fancy restaurant. She called, asking for help locating her physical resume for a job opening she'd found. As soon as she returned, I eagerly confirmed the listing, imagining how different our lives would be if she got the job. I set aside my work and started looking for her resume, which she told me was in the first document holder of a box where she kept her important papers. After going through the first folder with no success, I started pulling out each document holder, one by one. When I reached the third one, a few small notes and cards slipped out, and my curiosity got the better of me. But as I read them, my heart raced, each word feeling like a dagger to my chest. They were messages exchanged between my ex-wife and one of our professors, someone she'd often admired back in university. It became devastatingly clear that they'd been involved in an affair for years, something I'd never suspected. I struggled to comprehend the reality that she had betrayed me with a professor while we were together. Suddenly, so many things made sense, including the recurrent infections I had been treating, never suspecting she'd had another partner. In disbelief and heartbreak, I packed her documents back into the box, keeping some of the notes and cards with me. I told her I couldn't find her resume, knowing she'd be home soon. I offered to create a fresh copy for her, and she agreed, sending me her laptop password so I could edit and print it. Taking advantage of the moment, I accessed her social media accounts linked to her laptop. That's when I found the irrefutable proof of her affair with our former professor on Instagram. My heart shattered into even smaller pieces, quickly replaced by a surge of blinding anger. In that moment, I resolved to get my revenge. She trusted me completely, unaware of the fury growing inside me. I decided to sabotage her upcoming job interview by editing her resume in subtle but damaging ways. Then, I took photos of her messages with the professor on my phone and forwarded both the screenshots and her notes to our university, ensuring the affair would no longer stay hidden. When she arrived home that evening, I kept my silence, masking the storm inside as I pretended everything was normal. I even told her I was feeling unwell, hoping for some time alone after she submitted her resume. When the email arrived saying she wasn't a suitable candidate for the job, I knew it was time to reveal the truth. I told her what I'd done, expecting a mix of shock and disbelief. At first, she thought I was joking, but when I brought up her affair with the professor, her face turned pale as she realized I was serious. She dropped to her knees, pleading for forgiveness, but I couldn't bring myself to look past her betrayal. She tried to justify it, saying her relationship with the professor was only to help with our grades, but the notes I'd read told a very different story. I wasn't buying it. That night, I asked her to leave the house, my heart weighed down by a painful mix of anger and sorrow. I knew her parents deserved to know the truth, so I felt compelled to reach out to them and tell them everything she'd done. In the meantime, I'd already reached out to a lawyer to handle the divorce paperwork, and we finalized everything as soon as it was ready. As for the professor, he was well aware that relationships like theirs were strictly prohibited at our university. His indiscretion cost him his job, leaving both him and my ex-wife to face the consequences of their actions. After the divorce, she tried to come back, sending me countless messages on Facebook and Instagram, pleading for another chance. I blocked her on every platform, warning her not to show up at my apartment again, or she would deeply regret it. She never showed up. In the end, our marriage only lasted a year, but I was grateful to have uncovered her betrayal early. If I'd found out later, the pain would have run even deeper. Now, my focus is on my career and personal growth. Though I've been left hurt and betrayed, I know it'll take time before I'm ready to trust and open myself to another relationship. This story captures a complex situation where betrayal and disappointment tested a young couple. My choice to expose my ex-wife's affair and sabotage her resume may not have been my wisest, but it serves as a reminder of the importance of honesty and forgiveness in relationships.